Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our Wednesday webinar So what is a customs entry? There's been a lot of talk in the press, certainly earlier in the year, about customs and customs entries and Brexit and what it all means. But what do we actually mean by a customs entry and what actually has to be done? And who has to do it? And when are you supposed to do it? And what's the impact of doing it? That's what we're going to discuss this afternoon. So the first thing to say is it's quite easy about the when. You have to do a customs entry every time goods move across a border. And this is true today for goods that are moving to anywhere outside Europe or to the UK from anywhere outside Europe. Europe, you see, is special. It's different. It's not normal or usual. Usual is doing a customs entry every time the goods cross a border. And we do that today, as I say, for the rest of the world, just not the EU, because the EU is special. But on the 1st of January next year, 2021, the EU stops being special, and we will need to do customs entries for all goods crossing all borders, regardless of it being the EU or anywhere else. And that's true regardless of whether we get a free trade agreement of any kind with the EU, and I mean any kind, because there's never yet been a free trade agreement written anywhere in the world that gets rid of doing a customs entry. That's not what they're really there for. So the expectation from the government, from HMRC, our customs authority, and from all trade is that from the 1st of January, all goods to all countries will need this thing called a customs entry. And it has to be done both at export and at import. So there's always two in the chain, in any given supply chain. There can be more if it's a complex supply chain. Now, doing an entry merely means giving information about the consignment to the local customs authority. So it's the way that you do that is making an entry to their systems. That's why it's called making an entry. You are simply putting data into customs systems. That's also difficult because lots of people use different names for it. Now, the common parlance is to make a customs entry, understood all over the world, but other people call it making a declaration. You could be filling in a C88. You could be doing a single administrative document, a SAD form. But all these things, frontier declarations, you can have simplified declarations, all sorts of names. They're all just different names for making a customs entry, giving the data to customs at the point of export or import, wherever you happen to be. But the key thing is that at export and import, the goods can't leave the port or airport, or indeed the vehicle can't get on the ferry until the customs entry has been done and cleared, which means accepted as okay by the customs authority. So if you don't get it right or do it at the right time, what's going to happen is the goods are stuck in the port. And we often hear about goods stuck in customs. Now that's usually because a customs entry hasn't been done, or it hasn't been done right, or nobody's got the information in order to do it because the information is missing. So part of getting this done right and making the flow of goods through the supply chain smooth is to make sure the data is available so that we can do the customs entry at the key moment in time that is needed. And then we won't be delaying the goods and there won't be any difficulty. Now, what information do we need? Well, the first problem is that whatever information we've got to give has got to be coded, because customs computer systems around the world take code. They don't take words, except for names and addresses. Everything else is coded up in various ways, mostly numerical, some alphanumeric, and there are books and books and books of these codes for different elements of data, because a customs entry can contain up to 80 elements of data, all of which are coded, except for the addresses. So we've got to assess who is going to do this for us. Do they have the codes? Do we have the data that they can then change into the code? So we have to remember that whenever you change something, such as changing the name of an item that we're shipping, into the tariff code for that item, there is the chance of human error, or indeed machine error, because whoever put the data in the machine in the first place, if they put it in wrong, then you're going to get the wrong answer. Garbage in and garbage out, I'm afraid, is often the case. And if you have a large computer system, it's very easy for that to get out of date and to be misinterpreted, so that you get the wrong answers, the wrong information coming out the end that has to be given to customs. So this is something to watch out for. It's important to have the data right, and that includes all the codes. Now, where does this data go? Well, it's usually submitted electronically. This is normal to do it electronically around the world. And it goes into whatever your local customs authority's computer is. So in the UK, we have a computer called Chief. That's what customs run. It's the customs handling of import-export freight, but it's known as Chief. Now, Chief is an elderly computer and is on its way out. It's going for a long-needed retirement, hopefully sometime next year. And it's to be replaced by the new upstart on the block called CDS, the Customs Declaration System. CDS has moved on, obviously, to be a modern computer system, whereas Chief was written more than 30 years ago, the very dawn of computing. So we do need a new one. But CDS is a very different creature to Chief, as you would expect in computing terms. So much has moved on. And we still need data, but we actually need more data for CDS rather than less. So we've got to be prepared for whenever the switchover happens. Some people have been switched over already and are doing some imports through CDS, but most people have not, and we won't see a switch probably en masse until sometime next year, well into next year. But we must be prepared to be asked for extra data. Anyone can submit that data to customs, so long as they have the means. And unfortunately, the means is specialist software, because you have to have specialist software to talk to Chief. Because it's such an elderly computer, you need a front end. It was developed long before Windows ever came into play, long before you had icons, or you could do video conferencing such we're using as today. In fact, before email. So Chief is not very good at the electronic age, and therefore you need specialist software on the front end so we can interface with it in an appropriate way. But anybody can do that so long as they have the software and the access. Then you can put it in. But whilst anybody can input the data, they're called the declarant. Who is actually legally liable for the accuracy of that data? That is the next important question, because it isn't usually the declarant. It is usually the exporter or the importer, depending which end of the transaction we are doing. So the exporter and the importer have got to take steps to give the right information to whoever is putting this data into customs for them, if it's a third party, and then to check that what the third party has input to customs systems is actually what they asked them to put in. Which does mean that even if you use a third party, you can't get rid of the legal liability, and you can't get rid of the responsibility to check what they have done for you. You are still legally liable. And this is indicated who the actual liable parties are in the UK and the EU by the inputting of an EORI number. You've probably heard about that too with Brexit. The EORI number, which is the Economic Operator Registration and Identification number, is something that anyone who imports or exports has to have. So it's easily obtained online, doesn't take very long, and it's free. So there's no excuse for not having an EORI. However, it's essential to give that EORI to the third party and make sure that it's the right EORI that they've used, so the right person is legally liable for everything that's written down. Now, what's the sort of data that we have to provide? Well, it starts with names and addresses, the address of the exporter, the address of the importer, and the address of the declarant. Those are the three plain English fields that have to be input with EORI numbers in the EU and the UK. Even post-Brexit, we will have EORI numbers. So then we follow up with details about the consignment, and that will include flights or vessel names, depending on how it's going, or it could be registration plates of a truck. However it's moving. It's going to include details of the weight, the quantity, and the type of goods, all in code. It's then going to have information about the origin of the goods, and it's going to have information about the value of the goods. Now, origin and value, of course, are specialist customs fields, and we're dealing with those in other webinars. Value this afternoon, and origin is going to be next Wednesday. But you have to put the right data in. We also need something called a CPC code. Now, this is a customs procedure code, which indicates the type of export or import. In simple terms, it could be a permanent export instead of a temporary export. Two different codes. It could be a sale, it might be a repair or a loan. You're going to get different codes for all of those sorts of things. These are called CPC codes. So we have to make sure that we give that information over to the third party, or that it's input into our own computer if, as the exporter, we are doing, or the importer, we're doing our own entries. Because it is possible with major ERP systems to get bolt-on software, which means you can do your own entries electronically. But then, of course, you've got complete jeopardy, because the importer and exporter there can't ever wriggle away from saying, but somebody else put the data in. I'm afraid it's down to you if you do it yourself. You put the data in. Now, all this information goes into customs so that they can take your entry, and before the goods leave the port, they can say whether it's legal for your goods to leave the country or to come into the country. So it's compared to UK law if you're importing or exporting from here. And if it's okay, then you will be cleared, which means you get a ping back from the customs computer. Whoever put the data in, the declarant, gets a ping back that says the goods are cleared. The freight agent has to know that, and then they move the goods, and they may leave the port however they're supposed to be moving. But until that clearance comes through, they can't go. They can't go anywhere. So this is another reason for delays around customs entries, because if the wrong information or not enough information is provided, the goods are stuck in the port. Now, there are different methodologies, different procedures in customs, which means sometimes you can put in a simplified declaration, very little data on it except, hi, I'm here, there's a consignment coming, and then the goods are allowed to move. But of course, you do have to follow up then with the full declaration with all of the information, and that is time limited. It isn't a forever, very long piece of string. There is data has to be provided, and in that case, you're going to have two declarations tied together, with only the second one being really the one you need, with all of the data in it that has to be given to customs and that you need as the exporter or importer for your own records. Because this is another point we have to consider. It is the exporter and importer who are legally liable, so it is the exporter and the importer who must keep a record of this customs entry that was made on their behalf. Now, normally you'd expect your freight agent to email you one, perhaps, because they can press a button on Chief that gets them a printout. So they can then scan it, email it, whatever their system does to keep it, and you will get it electronically. You might get it in the post. From a fast parcels operator, you often get them in the post, and they're often attached to the bill for their work. So sometimes they don't go to the right people in your company, and it's important to retrieve them to keep them with the shipping record. Now, not only do you have to keep them, but you have to check them, and you need evidence that you have checked them to show that the data input is to your liking, it is correct. Now that, of course, means you're going to have to be able to read the code. Because if you can't read the customs entry, which is all code, then how can you check it against the data that you gave to the third party or that's in your systems? So somewhere along the line, someone in your organization is going to have to learn to read the code and understand the code so that you can double check it. Having checked it, you need to leave evidence behind that you've done so. So don't just glance through it and file it. You need to tick it or stamp it or sign it and date it something that will show an auditor that you actually did check it, and if you found any errors, you did something about it. Because there are plenty of things to be done about errors, but you can't do it unless you spot them. And you're supposed to spot them quickly, not 6 months later, but within a month, really, you should be noticing, if not a great deal sooner than that. Now, some of the problems with this is that, of course, if you're importing, duty and VAT are based on the translation of the goods description into a tariff code, because each tariff code has a separate duty and VAT rate attached to it. So this is going to mean that if there's an error in that translation, you're going to pay as an importer the wrong amount of import duty and VAT. This is an error. If you pay too much or you pay too little, it's still an error. And all errors on this customs entry are considered civil penalties, which means you can get financial fines. They're actual financial penalties for getting things wrong. And it can be anything from £250 per mistake. Remember, there's over 80 fields of data on a customs entry. That's £250 per field of data, up to £2,500 per field of data, if customs think you really are not paying any attention, and they want to make sure you do pay attention in the future. So the importer exporter can be penalised for getting this data wrong when this is discovered on audit. And that's any element of the data at all. Now, you need to keep your records for 7 years. That's when we must keep them, because they're for tax purposes. So 7 years is required. You can keep them electronically, you can keep them in paper, but however you keep them, you need backup. So really, if you keep the paper, you need an electronic version. If you've got an electronic version, you need the paper. Or at least with the electronic version, you need another backup of that electronic file that is accessible, that will remain for 7 years, and that you could get your hands on if you needed to, so that customs can see it, have it printed out, whatever they need. Now, when the data goes into Chief or CDS, customs can see all of that data. That's how they do their clearance. But when they come and audit you, they've already collected all that data together in a report and will compare that report to what records you have. So they will immediately know if there are holes in your records, because they've got a list already when they come and audit. So if your list is different, we know we've got a problem, and that too can get you a penalty. So the whole point of the entry is get it right, it smooths the path; get it wrong, it wrecks the path. And it also gets legal liabilities for the exporter and importer, which are financially burdensome and can spoil your reputation. You don't really want to go down as a tax dodger on the newspapers, do you? It's not a good thing. Now, at that point, I'll pause to take some questions.
Hi, it's Bruce here.
Hello, Bruce.
We use quite a lot of the small courier parcel services to do our export declarations for us, and we do an audit on our report we get for HMRC.
Right.
We have a lot of trouble getting them to do the amendments that we requested. So if we could prove that we've asked the request and an amendment, but they haven't done it, where would we stand on that?
Well, you'd stand as better than if you'd never asked them.
Yeah.
But you'd still be at fault because it was wrong.
Yeah. But if we supplied them the right information, but they entered the wrong information,
it's still your fault. And it's still your legal liability.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Okay.
This happens a lot. You're not alone.
Yeah.
This is quite common. And with the fast parcels operators that you're talking about there, they obviously do millions and millions of customs entries every day. So human error does loom large with the best of will in the world.
Yep.
And there's not always the best will in the world. Not always are their agents trained perhaps as well as they might be.
Yeah.
So things do happen, but it is your legal liability to get it put right. Now, the broker, the fast parcels operator, can make amendments within 30 days of the entry. After that, you're on your own.
Okay.
You can make those changes just as much as they can, but it's a little more manual. Instead of going through the link to Chief directly, you will employ forms. For export, there's a thing called a C81 form. You do get it online, which you will fill in, and then you will scan and email it, and the changes will be made. For import, there's a variety of forms, depending whether you've paid too much, too little, or exactly what's wrong. But there are forms which after 30 days you can do yourself. And frankly, after 30 days, you're probably better off doing it yourself.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
I have no questions on the chat. If anybody has a question, I will unmute all of you for a moment. If you have a question, feel free to ask. Any questions? No?
Okay. So in that case, I think the point that Bruce raised is very important, that when you do check them, the question then arises, how ships a month? And other companies will do thousands of shipments a month. So it is important to think about how many you check. Now, if you're a small company with just a half a dozen a month, you should be checking 100% of them. If you're in the thousands a week, then you're clearly not going to employ a staff of thousands to check every one of those manually, nor is it expected of you. But what you are going to be expected to do is do some kind of sampling exercise. And that has to be justifiable to customs. So that sample can be any number, that's your call, but it must be representative of different countries, different declarants, different modes of transport, different situations. So if you like, you're checking across the board. You're checking everything across the board in a sampling way. So not 100%, but you might decide 40% need checking. And if you've checked 40% for sort of 3 months and you've found almost no errors, then you might want to drop that down to 30%, and you could be justified in doing so. But you must always have a certain percentage that could be considered indicative being checked, and you should be looking for trends. If it's a particular declarant that's making a mess of things, you should be doing something about it, and there should be records, right down to the point where you stop using them, if you really can't get them to do their job properly. It's up to you, the exporter and importer, to arrange this in your own way. Now, I've said you've got to keep records of what you've checked and what you did about what you found, but you also need records of how you arrived at the information that you gave to the declarant. Because for each shipment, I mentioned you need the tariff code, you need an origin, you need a value. Well, how did you come by the value? You're supposed to tell the declarant, by the way, not leave them to guess. You're supposed to do that in writing, and customers will be looking for that in writing. Email does count. Electronic writing is fine, but in writing somehow. So how did you calculate the value? How did you arrive at the origin? How did you arrive at the tariff code? How did you arrive at any of the other data that is a calculated field? Well, you need records of how you did that, because in 3 years' time, and customs can have a whole 3 years before they audit, how are you going to remember what happened in that shipment January 3 years ago? Most of us would be lucky to remember what happened this January. In fact, last week would be doing well for some of us. So you really need records where you can open a file, electronic or paper, and actually say, oh yes, that's how I came by that information. Now I know why it was done and I can justify it. Whereas if you open the file and there's absolutely nothing there except some copies of documents, you're left guessing, and that's never a good thing. And if you go on to your declarant and say to them, hold on a minute, 3 years down the line. I told you to put £1,000 down. It looks like you put €1,000. Well, they're not going to remember either, are they? And nor have they any requirement to keep the records that long. You will find a fast parcels operator won't keep records probably beyond 3 months. If you're lucky then that they can access them for 3 months. It's not their place, it's yours. A freight agent might keep them longer, but they're likely to be in a box on a pallet on the top racking of some distant warehouse. So they're not going to be in anybody's memory or easily accessible half the time. And sometimes you wonder if they could ever find them. So you've got to make sure that you have this track and trace and you have this justification. So when you are audited by customs, you can produce the evidence of why you came to the conclusion you did. If you can do that, you're less likely to get into trouble, even if you got it wrong, than if you just open an empty file and say, I don't remember, so-and-so did that 3 years ago, they're not in the company anymore, haven't got a clue. That doesn't go down well. It doesn't show a willingness to be compliant. It doesn't show that you're on top of your export and import customs work, which is what customs are after all checking. They know we're all human and that every so often a mistake will pass us by, but they don't expect us to not be checking, to have no evidence of what we did or why we did it, so that we can go back on it and look at it scientifically, if you like, and see what happened. They expect that evidence to be there and for it to be there for 7 years. Because of course customs duty is the 3-year limit, although they can go 4 because financial years cost about the calendar. But VAT, which is also payable on imports, goes 7 years, which is why we keep everything for 7 years. So this is why an import entry or an export entry is of vital importance in the supply chain. Those who are preparing the information, the people they're giving that information to, and the people doing the input to the systems, even if it's electronic, from your own system, are vital to getting everything right for your company, lessening the risk in the supply chain and lessening your corporate liability. So this is not just a paper shuffling role. I think they called it form filling in the Financial Times last week, much to everyone's disgust. It is a form we are filling in technically, but there's an enormous amount of legal preparation behind that form filling in. It's a bit like saying a will is just a form, so it doesn't matter how you fill it in. Well, we all know it really matters. Well, the same is true for a customs entry. It really matters. So I hope that's helped. If there are any other questions, we've got time for just one perhaps. Other than that, I'll pass back to Claire.
Hello, Laura here.
Hello.
Hello. It just occurs to me, how do we learn these codes?
Well, there's several ways of doing that. You can get hold of the customs books. It's all in what's called the tariff, and study very, very large volumes of data. You can go on courses. There are training courses offered for doing this. Some are online, some are face-to-face. We offer face-to-face training because we think that's more helpful. But that is up to you. You have to look for that training from providers and either read the books which customs provide for free. You can get them online, but they are weighty tomes, I have to say. And if you've never delved in that before, it's going to be quite a task for you without a bit of guidance and assistance. Or you can go on some training courses. That's the way you have to learn.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. We're now coming to the end of our time. I'm going to stop the recording.